Welcome to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. On today's show, Dr. Joel Meyers and I discuss how weather played a major role in a 1979 daring desert mission to rescue American hostages at the U.S. Embassy in Tehran. Plus, what effect did this mission have on American politics? It's one of the questions we answer in our segment, What If? And we'll explain the butterfly effect and why some believe the desert sandstorm that prevented the hostages from being rescued also changed the balance of power in the United States for decades to come. It all starts now on Invisible Iceberg.
The availability of peaceful measures, like the patience of the American people, is running out. The American hostages must be freed.
The Iranian hostage crisis was a crucial moment in Jimmy Carter's presidency. In 1979, a group of armed Iranian students rushed into the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking over 60 Americans hostage. A daring military rescue mission was planned, but how did the weather threat in the desert cause this mission to fail? It's one of the fascinating stories in the book, Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History. Joining me now to help us understand how weather and other factors thwarted the attempted rescue is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Meyers. Dr. Joel, thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
November 4th, 1979. What happened?
What happened is that's when these students stormed the American embassy and took 66 hostages. The Shah of Iran was in the United States being treated for cancer. This was the chance they thought to overturn the government. There was a revolution. That's when the Iranian Revolution occurred. And as part of it, since the U.S. government backed the Shah, they took the Americans hostage, captured the entire embassy. And this started a long crisis that lasted for 444 days.
After a while, it became clear that negotiations were not going to work.
Well, there was no progress.
There was no
right.
progress.
Yeah.
What happened then? What did we decide to do?
Apparently the Carter administration, working with the military, planned for a daring rescue to land helicopters on the embassy grounds and recapture the embassy, get the hostages, and take them out. That was the plan, but it failed miserably. Was
weather part of the planning operation?
So there are sandstorms. Iran, and particularly Tehran, is in a desert. And one of the weather conditions in a desert are sandstorms. And they're often triggered, they're called a haboob, and they're often triggered by downbursts from thunderstorms. Thunderstorms develop, and part of it, the rain comes down, sometimes hail, and with it cold air, and then it spreads out. Well, when you have air coming down and spreading out, wind gusts of 20, 30, 40, even up to 50, 60 miles an hour, it picks up the sand, it's all dry, and creates this haboob, which is a sandstorm, and the visibility can fall to zero. So you have to avoid these storms. You have to know where the thunderstorms are and so on. So, and you also have to have equipment that's able to function with all the sand going into the gears and the motors and so on. It seems like none of that was planned for properly. I maintain that they could have used surveillance, satellite views, high-level airplane reconnaissance to look at the weather patterns, look for where the thunderstorms were, which the downdrafts were causing the haboobs. They probably could have come in from a different direction and avoided them. They just didn't use all the information available. It wasn't very well planned. The equipment failed. The weather was a big problem, and it was a disaster.
What does climatology say in the country of Iran when they get these sandstorms?
Yeah, the haboobs are most common in thunderstorms, as you might expect in the summer, in June, July, August. And the season starts to ramp up in late March, April, and May. They tried to rescue in late April. They would have had less of a problem with sandstorms if they had gone a couple months earlier or waited even to the fall. But President Carter had to rescue the hostages, because if he was going to be reelected, he knew he had to get the hostages out. The election was only 6 months away, 7 months away, and when he tried the rescue, if he waited till September, October, it was more risky. So I think politics played some role. Once it failed, the comments within the administration privately is, we just lost the election, and he was right.
And that ushered a new era in American politics for the United States. We're going to get to that in a second. Here with more insight on the Iranian hostage crisis is Colonel Bill Butler. He's the acting president at the National Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus, Ohio. Thanks for joining us today, Colonel Butler.
Thank you for having me. What a great opportunity.
How did Operation Eagle Claw begin?
2 days after the Americans were seized, planning began. It was a very complex plan. It involved Navy ships and Navy aircraft, Marine pilots. It involved Delta operators from Delta Force. It involved a small contingent of special forces from a 10th Special Forces group in Europe. It involved Army Rangers, and then it involved U.S. Air Force pilots piloting those aircrafts.
Let's get into how the rescue would end up working.
Yeah, so 3 weeks before the operation was to take place, U.S. Air Force Combat Controller went into the airfield. It was a dry lake bed, and did an assessment on the lake bed to make sure that it could handle the load of the aircraft on the lake bed, and it was fine. In that intervening 3-week period, a sandstorm came through, and it had ankle-deep dust-like talc sand that was across the whole lake bed. So when those aircraft came into land, of course, you can imagine from the prop wash from the C-130s and from the helicopters, just this tremendous brownout, these conditions that the pilots can't see. And you've got aircraft landed all over this lake bed, and then you've got to reposition the helicopters so that they can refuel because they are already at their max legs, and fuel consumption was pretty bad. And then when the helicopters flying from the Nimitz into the lake bed, two of them experienced mechanical issues, a hydraulic issue and a cracked rotor blade. So they had to return to the USS Nimitz. And then another one, there's a sandstorm in between the Nimitz and Desert One. They experienced sand getting into the engine, so they had to turn around too. So now they're down from 8 helicopters to 5 operational, and they needed 6 to do. That was the men force to do 6, have 6 helicopters to do the operation.
You were talking about the sandstorms. Was that a consideration for planning the rescue?
As part of that terrain assessment, weather is included in that. But you have to think, it was 44 years ago. We didn't have the access to Doppler radar and computerized models and the systems that we have today to accurately predict the weather.
Then what happened after the operation was aborted? One of the helicopters crashed, correct?
Yeah, so they made the decision to recommend to abort the mission. The president approved the recommendation of the commanders on the ground to abort, and they still needed to refuel the helicopters to get the troops and the equipment out of Desert One. So as they were repositioning the helicopters to get to the EC-130s that had the fuel blivets inside, like I said, that fine talc dust that was on the lake bed, as one of the helicopters moved up to reposition, he was under the control of a U.S. Air Force combat controller. That combat controller was physically directing the aircraft, and he had flashlights directing them. As he was moving back to direct the helicopter pilot didn't realize that he was moving back. He thought that the helicopter was drifting. So as he's moving forward in brownout conditions, he can only see these ambient lights and these glows from the flashlights that were directing him. He didn't realize that the Air Force C-130 was right there. So as he's moving forward, thinking he's drifting back, he runs right into one of the tail booms of one of the C-130s. And so the air crew on the helicopter, the whole crew is either burned horrifically or killed. And then the crew on the C-130 are killed as well.
How did this mission change future Joint Special Operations?
We didn't have a Special Operations Command. We didn't have a Joint Special Operations Command. We didn't have integration with units. We didn't have a clear line of or a delineation of the chain of command who was in charge. So you have multiple commanders on the ground. So it really created, because of this failure, as tragic as it was, it enabled the United States military to then assess itself to determine what we needed to do to be successful in the event that we had another, terrorist attack, if you will, on United States sovereignty, to the degree that it was going to be this complex, somewhere around the world. So the fallout of that was the creation of the United States Special Operations Command.
Colonel Bill Butler, acting president at the National Veterans Memorial and Museum in Columbus, Ohio. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. It's time for our segment, What If? We're looking at how the 1979 Iranian hostage crisis may have helped Ronald Reagan win the White House. Joining me again is AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, Dr. Joel Meyers. Before we get into the what if, I want to go back. When you heard about how all of this unfolded with the dust storms and the tragedy, what were your thoughts? And I have to ask, what would have happened if AccuWeather was consulted?
Beforehand, I assume.
Yeah.
Well, I was obviously, as a normal American, was watching Nightline and was concerned about the whole situation. I think the idea of attempting to rescue the hostages was the right thing. But if AccuWeather had been consulted, and of course you could only judge this with hindsight, second guessing, but I would have made sure that we used all the surveillance above with satellites, with high-flying planes, and looking at the weather situation and making sure the meteorologists who were in on the mission, and I don't know who they were, for the Air Force or whatever, certainly had all the latest information, because the risk, and I don't know if they really considered it, was these haboobs. I don't know if they had experience forecasting for that area or not, but we know in that part of the world, haboobs are the greatest threat, and these sandstorms, visibility to zero, they really cause serious problems with particularly helicopters, and clearly they were not prepared. They didn't come in from the right direction, or they weren't. That was not the time to do it.
Yeah, and you mentioned the time of the year. I mean,
Time
you
of the year,
wanted the
or
risk
even-
factor, right?
And the weather pattern.
Right.
I mean, clearly this was not a good weather pattern to try and do that.
Well, let's get into this. What impact do you think the failed mission had on the election?
Well, I think historians are quite clear that Jimmy Carter lost the election. He might have lost anyway. His popularity was declining, but clearly when the mission failed, Carter was a one-term president. He was running for a second term. Ronald Reagan was running against him. Ronald Reagan won handily. And so it really changed from a Democratic administration to a Republican administration, and very different policies. Ronald Reagan was in favor of smaller government, less spending, a strong military, and he implemented all those policies. The Soviet Union collapsed and fell apart during his period. That was part of his goal. The economy, after two recessions, he worked with Volcker, who was chair of the Federal Reserve, to engineer two recessions to take the inflation out of the economy. People forget, when Jimmy Carter was president, inflation got up to 20%. We today talk about inflation at 5, 6, 7, and how damaging it is. Think about that period when inflation was up to 20%. Mortgage rates went over 20. You had to pay 21% interest on a mortgage for your home. It was crazy. And so all this, counted against. So between Paul Volcker and Ronald Reagan cooperating, two recessions, they squeezed all the inflation out of the economy. And bonds, the long-term bond interest rates went from 17%, started their long decline to when they just recently bottomed out, at a couple percent.
You're talking about some of the accomplishments that Ronald Reagan had. Was that one of his greatest accomplishments, or were there others during that period that you can remember?
Well, certainly the economy,
yeah,
and was a big success. Shrinking the size of government, winning the Cold War. I mean, these were major achievements, obviously, and it set the pattern for the country. We had Republican administrations right through 2008. So for the next 28 years, with the exception of 8 years with Bill Clinton. But Clinton was a fiscal conservative.
He was.
Some say he actually balanced the budget a couple of times. So he was more like a Republican. So we had 28 years of fiscal conservative government.
This is going to be a tough question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. I want you to think about it here. What if the rescue mission would have been successful? That it turned out we got our hostages back. What do you think would have happened? It's a tough question.
It is a tough question, and nobody knows the answer. We can just speculate, of course. But if Jimmy Carter had won re-election, the country obviously would have gone in a different direction. Who knows how or why, but most people agree Carter was not a strong president. He was not always as articulate, certainly, as Ronald Reagan, who had been a movie actor and was very articulate and saying what he wanted and what he stood for.
You know, it's interesting. It's just another example how one event, one domino that falls in a certain direction changes the whole outcome, doesn't it?
It does. In this case, certainly it did. And there's been very little talk about what caused it, but this failed rescue attempt, which was because of the weather, really had a tremendous impact on the politics and the direction of the United States of America for decades to come.
It's just a fascinating story and a what if, how things could have been different. I want to thank AccuWeather founder and executive chairman and author of the book Invisible Iceberg, Dr. Joel Meyers. Again, Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History, for joining us today.
My pleasure, as always.
All right, coming up next, we dive into the butterfly effect and look at how it ties into the weather phenomenon known as teleconnections. We'll be back after the break. Welcome back to Invisible Iceberg. I'm Bernie Rayno. After the failure of Operation Eagle Claw, a series of events followed that changed the balance of power in the United States and the world that would influence economics and politics for decades into the future. One can hypothesize that this series of events is similar to the butterfly effect. This theory was created by Edward Lorenz. He postulated that a butterfly flapping its wings in one part of the planet can set off a series of atmospheric factors that will change the weather somewhere else on the planet days or weeks later. Now, while a butterfly flapping its wings cannot change the weather, the principle of this theory is correct, as the weather across the globe is interconnected. In meteorology, we call these relationships teleconnections. Simply put, the weather in one part of the world can influence the weather in another part of the globe. Now, an example of this is a piece of string, a simple piece of string that if you pull downwards, you'll get a ripple effect moving downstream. These ripples in the atmosphere are disturbances in the jet stream, a fast-moving river of air about 6 miles above the ground. One of the most well-known teleconnections pertains to typhoons in the Western Pacific. A typhoon that recurves or moves north-northeast of Japan often results in a dip in the jet stream along the eastern United States 8 to 10 days later. These dips result in significant cooling and at times precipitation. This change in the weather across the eastern U.S. all due to a typhoon's movement thousands of miles to the west. That's our show for today. For more information and get your copy of the book Invisible Iceberg, When Climate and Weather Shaped History by Dr. Joel Meyers, go to invisibleiceberg.com. We look forward to seeing you next time.